So I'm going to really break this talk into several sections. I'm going to talk first of all what agriculture has done to support the things that Kate talked about in terms of the climate change strategy. Then I'm going to go on to what some of our observations are when we work in this particular field. Then I'm going to quickly move on to what we see as new influences that are facing us today. And Brian Weech talked a little bit about that earlier this morning from the Wildlife Federation. I'm going to expand on that quite a bit more. And once we get to the end of the new influences that we talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about the policy conundrums that's going to represent, and then go on to some of the conclusions. I'll talk first of all what we're going to have in terms of, if you look at the current activity right now, it breaks into three areas, and it's mostly into research, programming, and extension. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to just quickly cover the waterfront in terms of what we do to support the climate change strategy. So we do a lot of research within the department. That's mostly around protocol development, validation studies, to really get something that has a protocol that is eligible under the carbon trading system that Kate talked about. The requirements that are going on within the protocol development on the accounting side are increasing. So the data requirements are increasing. We're going from something called a limited, which is really you can use a proxy to say that you've actually done that particular protocol, to something called a reasonable, where you have to have a more, I'll call it rigorous data component to prove that you've actually done that protocol. And we've worked with the producers to help them get from A to B, and that's been a little bit of a challenge. Professional opinion documents, Kate had mentioned the AIA, the Alberta Institute of Agrologists Code of Practice. Obviously we are engaging the agrologists because they potentially are a professional arm that could help us in terms of the protocol development and the verification of the practices that are going on. And then I'll talk about measurements a little bit. We've done some research there on life cycle analysis. Those of you who aren't familiar with life cycle analysis, that's really looking at in a scientific way, seeing how different practices have impact on the environment. So we've done, well, about 6 of those in the last 4 or 5 years. Over the last 3 years, we did 4 in particular using federal government funding. We focused on chicken, eggs, Canadian Colonial Council was when we worked out as well, and Alberta potatoes. And prior to that, we did beef and pork as well. So that was more on the measurement side. Programming side, some of you in this room are probably familiar. We have the Growing Forward dollars. Growing Forward is a provincial federal program where we actually deliver funding to producers. We have a program in particular called the On-Farm Energy Program, and that's to offset some of the costs that producers want to have new equipment or new infrastructure on the farm that reduce their emissions. This will help offset some of the costs. I won't get too much in the details, but it's usually about 50% of the cost, up to a max of $50,000. We have other environmental stewardship programs, but this is the one that relates mostly to climate change. I'm going to skip the next one because that shouldn't even be up there. Extension, obviously we do a lot of work with our producer groups. We do a lot of farmer meetings, trade fairs. We talk about irrigation efficiencies with some of the stakeholders we have there. We get involved in composting and recycling as well. So that's what we do. What are the learnings we've had from some of the work we've done with the industry on an ongoing basis? The first is, if you're going to have a national inventory and a carbon offset system, you really have to have an integrated approach. The evolution has been from a reductionist kind of science to more integrated science. So really, if you're going to set an inventory or carbon offset strategy, you've got to have the breeder talking to the agronomist, talking to the economist. And that's what we have in most cases. You need a strong operational policy, and what we mean by this is farmers need to know the rules of the game. They need to have confidence in the system as well. So Kate kind of outlined a little bit about the registry and really setting in place the protocols, the rules, the standards that you have to make if you're going to actually have a carbon and you're going to get credit for it and be able to trade that in an open market. So that's fairly important to put that in place. Implementation more than a protocol, this is fairly important. Protocols are one thing, but the farmers that are working this on an ongoing basis, they need to know how to actually do a contract, for example. They need to know how would you actually, what kind of machinery would you need to buy if you're going to be eligible for credit on a protocol. We talked a little bit about, we have to work with the farm financiers as well, so they understand how the system works. When they're giving out loans, they need to know from an insurance side how much guaranteed this income is coming through. Clearinghouse, we didn't talk about that a little much, but you got to really bring the buyers and the sellers together, and you have to have a mechanism that will be able to do that. And that's really what the oversight and the registry, which again was what Kate talked about earlier, is having that in place. The last one is on the verification, making sure you got good records in place, and we can't stress this enough. Good records are very important. In the past, again, the science on this has evolved as well. When we looked at what's considered a good practice, often that was based on a scientific based on plots. And as we all know, crop plots are often done on the best soil out there. And so that doesn't always accurately reflect what's actually happening out in the field. So we're getting a little better in terms of putting together models that will actually go across the landscape and be able to scale up to what an actual farm looks like. So we see a lot of convergence there. There is one, I guess, other learning that's not up here that I do want to talk about, and I'll come back to it later, and that's the increased costs on the transaction side. So Kate talked a little bit about how the requirements are increasing in terms of the data and also the rigor of the kind of scientific and the professional that has to be in place. All these are adding transaction costs. When you look at the agriculture industry, for example, compared to other sectors, you don't have the critical mass of large corporations that can dedicate people to do all the data collection to meet the carbon credit standards. What you have is private farmers, private landowners that are operating on very tight margins that are not always in the position to do this. So one of the things from a policy point of view we're going to have to be really cognizant of as we get further on is as we make these transaction costs more expensive, the danger is we're going to be limiting the number of people that are eligible to participate in these kind of systems. So we may be limiting ourselves to the top 1% or even 5% of the farming population. And the climate change strategy was really intended to be more encompassing. It was really intended to have more people involved. So that's going to be a challenge, and as a government, it's something that we really need to look at. So I'm going to switch directions altogether. So we've talked about what we've known, we've talked about what they've learned, but instead of, I guess, waiting around and waiting for the science to catch up to us, for the government systems to catch up to us, we really got to keep our eye on other things that are going on there. And these are significant drivers that I think are really going to play very big, particularly in the next 3 to 5 years. It was alluded to earlier, and I mentioned that Brian Weech had talked about this in Worldwide Federation. I'm going to go into a little more detail. So I say meanwhile companies. So companies right now, major companies, and I've got a few of them listed up there. We got Unilever, Starbucks, McDonald's, are really coming forward with a lot of really aggressive sustainability platforms. And the requirements that they're placing on the supply chains, in particular primary agriculture, which most of them identify as having the largest footprint within their supply chain, is getting more and more real. So for example, McDonald's Canada, and it was mentioned earlier, had just announced in January of this year that they'll begin buying sustainable beef, sustainable, they haven't actually defined that, by 2016. In March of this year, McDonald's has officially announced that they will be launching a pilot project in this province. They will be looking at beef, which they consider one of their bigger footprints. In talking to the executives within the McDonald's, they say that beef represents about 20 to 30% of the footprint in their operations. The reason they picked Alberta, very simple. Alberta, all of the trimmings that come, the trim that comes from Cargill and JBS goes up to the Cargill plant in Spruce Grove and goes out to all the McDonald's restaurants across Canada. So you've got a closed system there, which is fairly easy for them to work with on a pilot basis. And they're interested in looking at sustainability, first of all, defining sustainability and how that's going to work in their supply chain. And the group they're working with is the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. So there's a good example from a very real example, I guess, of how from the corporate side this is becoming very real. This isn't academic anymore. This isn't theoretical. This is a real company. McDonald's, just to give you an idea of the impact they have within Alberta, about 85 million metric tons come out of JBS, Cargill, go into the plant in Spruce Grove, and go out to all McDonald's restaurants across Canada. If you're not in line with McDonald's and meeting their sustainability platform, and this is something we have to be careful when we work with them, but you got to find a home for 85 million metric tons. So you can imagine what that would have, what the impact that would have within the supply chain, how that'll bid prices down for the fed cattle. And this is a very real thing that'll have impact right at the farm gate. So McDonald's isn't the only one. Unilever is an example of another very large corporation that's heavily involved in this. I put this slide up here because what you have happening globally is a lot of consolidation. You got a number of big names that control probably a number of, well, the majority of the brands that we see in the food industry right now. Their impact and the influence they have probably reaches about between 70–80% of the primary producers across the globe. So when these companies come to the table and start talking about sustainability, it's something that we really have to pay attention to. This is just an example of the kind of labeling or green labeling programs we see. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. You see it there, and I'm sure you've seen it in any retail store that you've been in. So that's on the company side. There's other influencers here, and I was alluded to a bit this morning, but we've got roundtables, we've got the nonprofit groups, and then we have governments. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. In terms of the roundtables, we have an international group, and again, Brian had mentioned this morning a group called the Global Sustainability Roundtable. That's for the beef, the Global Beef Sustainability Roundtable. McDonald's is a major pusher of that group. They first met in 2010 in Denver. They have just recently, as mentioned this morning, had published their principles of sustainability, and that's open for public comment until May 16th. The McDonald's project I talked about, they're taking their definition from sustainability from this group, the Global Sustainability Roundtable. So that's on the beef side. We've got another international group on the crop side, and it's called the Sustainability Consortium. And as I'll show you in a second, they've got a list of equally impressive companies on that side. Again, they're working with the primary production, the primary producers. They're jointly deciding or determining what principles of sustainability is. The idea here, or the objective for these guys, is they want to get a good sense of what sustainability is from a definitional point across the globe. But on the beef side, for example, you've got different practices across the globe. You've got grass-fed beef, you've got grain-fed beef. So you can't apply that across the globe. And so what's happened is we have national organizations, and that's the Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Beef, that will help define regionally what sustainability looks like. So as I mentioned, TSC, I should have defined that. That's the Sustainability Consortium. And that's on the crop side. This morning we heard about the beef side. Again, just for illustration purposes, I want to put up how you've got an impressive group of companies that are there as well. I talked about the nonprofits a little bit. World Wildlife Federation, again, we heard from them this morning. Brian Weech had a lot of good points that are going to be similarly brought up in this presentation. This is a slide actually taken out of one of their presentations, and it's a very deliberate strategy that they undertake. And the way they explain it is this: it's the wine glass. So you can either target the 1 billion producers across the globe at the stem of the wine glass, or you can try to influence sustainability with the 6 or 7 or 8 billion consumers. I have it 6 because there's a lot of consumers that they're not targeting. Or you could focus your energy on the 300 to 500 companies that are in the stem, that are in the middle. And these are the companies that have 70% of the marketplace across the globe. And that's what the World Wildlife Federation has done. So for example, they've teamed up with Starbucks coffee in about 19,000 of their restaurants across the world. And they have put their brand on there as well in some cases, but the idea is to work in partnership with them to get sustainability objectives in place. Another good partner for World Wildlife Federation has been Coca-Cola. Consumers is the last part of this equation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about consumers because a lot of people more intelligent than me have spent an entire career looking at consumer trends. But really it's about social license, it's about healthy food, and about market access. We signed a number of key market access agreements. CETA, for example, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with Europe, where these attributes of sustainability are very keen, and if you're going to play in those markets, you have to have those part of the equation. So this is the policy conundrum. I'll go through it very quickly. There's two ends of the spectrum, and Karen talked about this already earlier. We've got the compliance end, which is very command and control. It's about regulatory based. There's no trust in the system. It's very records keeping based. The other extreme of that is the retail markets, which is coming from the marketplace. From a government's role perspective, we have a much larger role when we're on the left-hand side, the compliance side, than we do on the right-hand side. We're using different tools as well. On the left-hand side, we're using regulatory and enforcement. On the right-hand side, we're using incentives and, in some case, information to move things forward. So what now? Again, I'll just go back to what I talked about. Transaction costs are increasing. You can't expect farmers to be accountants, so it's a challenge that we have to deal with going forward. We're really getting this balance between regulatory control and the retail influence. We're going to be engaging in roundtables, as I mentioned, and it's about this creative tension that exists between the two.